in politics.
Fascinating. There's a small point I'd like to follow up on the cadres, North and South, because it's something that's of real interest to me. But if you thought about having 1,000 cadres in the North and 1,000 cadres in the South, and I think what you were interested in doing was finding some difference between them that would account for the party's success in the North and relative failure in the South. A premise that I take on any social group is that there is a range of opinion or a range of characteristics, that social groups are heterogeneous. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering how your mind accommodates the fact that the 1,000 northern cadres don't agree down to the last detail about politics, about doctrine, about the workings of the party, etc. So how do you try to aggregate, basically, differences which you can then say are meaningful causal differences?
Sure. I think I work in two ways dealing with those kinds of issues. The first way in which I work is fairly conventional, the imposition of statistical controls. Even when the numbers are small, one can always entertain hypotheses for the explanation of differences that are different than the cause that one is looking for. So, for example, if I had found that all of the type A cadres came from large cities in Italy, regardless of region, while all of the type B cadres came from small towns, then the variance would be explained by the big cityness or the small townness rather than the northness or the southness. But if the variations survived, despite the imposition of these controls, then one couldn't reduce the findings to the result of urbanization. And a series of statistical controls of that sort, male, female, old, young, urban, rural, left-wing, right-wing, could be imposed to see if the hypothesis of interest survived all those tests. But that's only one way in which social scientists work, and I suspect that more of them work in the second way than would like to admit it. And that second way has to do with intuition. It has to do with the result of serendipitous findings. It has to do with the strength of a particular observation, which may have come from a single data point and not from a statistically significant data point. And that's the way I worked. When I began my interviews, I carried out maybe 20 or 30 of these interviews in different parts of the country. 4 or 5 of them stood out because they were interviews that I was willing to use. I mean, every interview and every data point in an empirical research can be an interview or a data point based on observation or based on information. Your respondent can be an informant as well as a participant. And many of these interviews, which were non-systematic in method, although they were systematic in analysis, many of these interviews produced information from respondents as informants as well as participants. And some of them were the best informants that I might have. And I learned very early that some of the more skilled, professional, academic informants were much less informed about the reality I was trying to study than the people I was looking at in the first place. And I guess that means the social scientist ought to find a way of being engaged with his or her informants and participants in an iterative way. I guess that means rather than coming to the field with a fully worked out research schedule or protocol that the research schedule ought to be susceptible to change, to development, as new information comes about. And that was a lesson I took to my third book, which was quantitative analysis of the decade of social movements in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s. By that time, I was a bit more skilled at quantitative analysis than I had been when I started out. I also had the help of some skilled research assistants, and I put together a protocol for the analysis of newspaper articles on social protest in Italy from 1966 to 1974. The book that came out of this was called Democracy and Disorder, a decade of protest and politics in Italy. And I went to the newspaper record with a relatively rigid research protocol asking a certain number of questions of the articles, which sometimes would be answered and sometimes wouldn't, and very quickly discovered on looking at the first responses, the first filled-in protocols, that there were issues that I hadn't raised additionally. Luckily, by that time, and this was the late 1970s, early 1980s, luckily by that time, social scientists were no longer obliged to use simply closed-ended questions in their research protocols. In fact, the computer could provide you not only with a coded response, but it could also provide you with space in which you could fill in the words of a particular answer. And for many of these questions that I asked my coders to ask of the newspaper articles, I left space for them to say, if it doesn't respond to coded items 1, 2, 3, or 5, fill in the information, which may eventually enable us to add numbers 6, 7, 8, 9, and up to infinity. So the computerized record was a combination of pre-coded information, for example, on what date did the event take place, how many people were involved, but also non-pre-coded information, verbal information, because at the time people were beginning to learn ways of searching through electronic information to find keywords that could eventually be turned into coded information. And this was a method that I'm happy to say I learned from Chuck Tilley, who was at the same time beginning, he had actually already begun, to code some 60-odd years of British social history, and in which he was completely refusing to include pre-coded information. I wasn't quite ready to go that far, but what I learned from Tilley was that there were now computer programs that could put both pre-coded and verbal information on the computerized record, and that eventually one could go back and dump, that was the term we used at the time, an entire page full of non-pre-coded information in verbal form onto these enormous sheets of computer paper, and go back over them and add coded information for new issues that hadn't occurred to you in the first place. This is all by way of saying, I think one way in which my work differs from most statistical social science is not only that it's less sophisticated methodologically, which it is, but also that it includes a willingness to regard the research instrument as an iterative instrument and not as an instrument that must be completely decided on at the beginning of the research.